Onassis Foundation. Dublab.
Welcome to the Quarantine Tapes, a daily podcast from Onassis LA and Dublab. Hosted by Paul Holdengräber, this series chronicles shifting paradigms in the era of social distancing.
Hello.
Hello, could I please speak with Victor Brombert?
I am speaking.
Victor, it's such a pleasure to have you on the phone and such a pleasure for me to have you be part of the Quarantine Tape. Thank you so much for taking the time.
It's great to hear the word pleasure in these dark times.
There
is still some pleasure for some of us. Some of us who are privileged and love to be home anyhow in our study and meditate maybe, or read, or write, who love solitude. But that's very special in these dark and nightmarish times. I sometimes have a feeling of living in a science fiction nightmare.
It really is. It really is that. I had occasion recently of speaking with William Gibson, one of the great science fiction writers, and for him it's really hard at this moment to write science fiction.
One cannot compete. It outdoes it.
Yeah, and I'm glad you picked up. It's such a Victor Brombert gesture to pick up on one word, in this case the word pleasure. I had the great pleasure, might I say, of rereading last night your beautiful essay in The New Yorker called The Permanent Sabbatical, which was published 2 years ago in January of 2018. And in it you describe a walk you take through the Parc Monceau, a park I know well in Paris, and you say, "From my bench I can see, from my bench I can see." You repeat that a couple of times, and I'm wondering, what can you see now, both literally and metaphorically, from your bench?
Well, my bench now is my study, my cell. It is that locus of solitude that I'm used to, because I love to be in it, but now I try to make the most of it. I read, and I remember that at some point in the past I have written about the happy prison, that indeed there has been a long tradition of finding even in prison a certain beauty. There is a wonderful sonnet of Wordsworth about, I think it begins with, "Nuns fret not in their narrow convent room, and hermits are contented in their cells." So it's basically the image of the monk, the solitude that brings out or makes it possible to, first of all, enter into communion with oneself, but also perhaps have insight into spiritual values. This is all speculation of a poetic nature. It's not obviously what people who really suffer physically or economically at this point can enjoy.
But you can, and in a sense, connaître par cœur, knowing by heart certain poems, knowing by heart certain passage of literature, is something that has accompanied you for, I think, a very, very long time. And what you just came up with Wordsworth. What other works stay in your mind, and perhaps what sticks in one's mind is not always what is most important for us to remember, but there's certain things we remember as we grow older that are really important.
Of course, one can recite it like music. One cannot really enjoy poetry unless one knows some poetry by heart and has appropriated it. Just as with music, one can't really enjoy it deeply unless, in my opinion, one has mastered some element of music oneself. I keep thinking of certain books. It could be The Charterhouse of Parma of Stendhal, or King Lear. King Lear at the end, when he regains Cordelia, and he says, everything is lost, he knows, but he says, come, let's away to prison. And there they will be like birds in the cage. They'll be singing. And in this song, they will be like God's spies and have insight into things. Well, all these, I say, are poetic possibilities, and I personally, at this point, yes, enjoy more than ever, find consolation for the horrors, more than ever in my privacy. But this is an old tradition. Gandhi, the Indian philosopher, statesman of non-violent resistance, used to send a telegram to his followers who had been arrested and imprisoned. He said, congratulations, now you will know what freedom means. Jean-Jacques Rousseau said somewhere that he would like to be imprisoned in the Bastille because there he would write a book on freedom. Benvenuto Cellini said, in Zetta Prigione, in this prison, he found God. It's an old tradition that somehow this confinement can be a resource of profounder love and profounder spiritual values. But, as I said before, there is the tragic side of it. The tragic side, which is, of course, that it reminds us, imprisonment reminds us that we are all condemned. Pascal had this image. Pascal said that all the unhappiness of humanity comes from the fact that they cannot somehow stay alone in a room. But on the other hand, he said that we are all like condemned men waiting to be executed, and those who are not yet to be executed are watching in silence and horror because they know that that's their fate. So it's also the image of an increased image of our mortal condition. We are reminded, maybe it's a good thing to be reminded, because once one is reminded of what our human condition is, one then perhaps can value each moment of life even more.
Because we are condemned to an end, we should really live fully this moment. I remember my mother always saying that living is dangerous and the outcome is always fatal.
I don't know, you probably know the French. Well, Pascal used to say, or said somewhere in his writings, le dernier acte est toujours sanglant. It's a wonderful image because it's a theatrical image. Le dernier acte, of course, of tragedy, usually there is blood somewhere. It's not on the stage, but in the background. But what he had in mind, of course, is that the end is always terrible. But it is the reminder, because this gets us back to the image of the cell, hermits who are contented in their cell, because it's the image of the monk in the cell. Why in the cell? Because there he is confronting, looking, staring at the four walls. He's confronting his own destiny, the meaning of life, better than when you walk in the woods. At least that's what the thought is.
Victor.
So yes, I've been reading books. I've been reading rereading about the plague, of course.
And what you've been rereading books about the plague and books that have the plague as a subject. Which ones grab your attention, and which ones do you think are really valuable at this moment when we are all, so to speak, in a cell?
Well, there's one book that surprised me because it's Boccaccio's Decameron, which most of us know because of it's the licentious stories that these 7 women and 3 men tell each other. But the reason they are together is they have escaped from Florence, where there is a plague. And I had forgotten, or I didn't know, until I reread. Rereading is an important activity.
Right.
The introduction of Boccaccio, in which there are graphic, very precise descriptions of the horrors of the plague. This is the plague in, I think it was in 1340 or 48, 1348, I think, La Mortifera Pestilenza in Florence. It's extraordinary. These few pages are wonderful. Then there is another Italian text that comes to mind. It's Manzoni. It's perhaps the best known Italian novel. In Italy, everybody reads it, has read it. It's part of family lore. Manzoni's Promessi Sposi, the betrothed. And he describes in it the plague in Milan in the middle of the 17th century. And then, of course, more recently, it's a wonderful book. It's Camus' The Plague, La Peste, which was written in 1947, shortly after the war, and which describes fictionally a plague in so-called in a city in North Africa, Oran. But the extraordinary thing about this book is that it comes up with, at the end, the plague disappears, but he says, yes, but we mustn't rejoice. It will come back again. It will come back, as we hear today. And he says there can be no armistice. The hero of or the central character, called the chief character, is a doctor, medical doctor. And the plague will return, he knows it. And we must do our job as doctors, although we know ultimately we cannot defeat death. But you have to be not a hero and not a saint, but a human being, a mensch.
A mensch.
There is no permanent victory. There are only endless defeats. But these are endless. That means that's what we have to live with. And the image there goes back to Camus' interpretation of the myth of Sisyphus. Sisyphus, who has been condemned for eternity to push up a heavy, heavy rock up a hill. And then it rolls down again, and then he starts all over, pushes it up again, it rolls down again, and goes on and on. And it's a hopeless, but it's the pride he takes in doing it. In other words, Sisyphus is happy
right.
in the condemnation.
I always love that last line. Il faut imaginer Sisyphe heureux. One has to imagine Sisyphus happy.
Yeah.
I wonder I mean, of course, we could go on speaking with great pleasure again about Camus, however dire the subject may be. Have you, in this life you've had, Victor, have you ever lived through a moment like this one? I mean, you've lived such intense moment. I think of, Pétain and France and your own involvement in the.
This is what worries me.
Tell me.
This is what worries me, because so far we have been, you and I, talking about the poetic aspect and what one can gain in spiritual or poetic values, and the image of the Sisyphus rolling up, pushing up the rock and finding pride in doing that. But yes, I have lived through the occupation of France under the Nazis. I've lived through the war. I landed on Omaha Beach. I was in the Battle of the Bulge. But the images that come back mostly, and that's what worries me, are the war and the occupation, during which there was rationing, during which there was hunger, during which there was black market, during which people began by helping one another, but then it lasted and people began to develop hostility toward each other, toward one another. And there were denunciations that led others perhaps all the way to concentration camps, to extermination camps. And so there are psychological and sociological consequences that worry me, because if it lasts long enough, we may see violence. Already we know of hoarding, already we know of denunciation, already we know of people who look at some strangers who have an Asiatic look at them with hostility and even attack them. So, it's very nice to say, because I am privileged. I sit here in a nice home. My whole professional life has been that sedentary type, and I can afford it, fortunately. But there are people for whom this is a horrendous event, and when you think of the people who lost jobs and have to bring up children and have to feed the family, and what the consequences, the social, moral consequences in behavior will be, it's hard to predict.
Do you the fears you're speaking about now? Do you see signs of them already?
I'm sorry?
Do you see signs of the fear you're talking about? Do you see signs already?
Well, so far where we are, my wife and I, we are surrounded by friends. We live in a quiet place, surrounded by beautiful trees. People are helpful. People volunteer to go buying for one. And I am perfectly aware of the special circumstances and privileged circumstances under which we live in a house. But it's different in a small apartment, in an area where it's very crowded, in a small apartment in the slums. It's bad enough under normal circumstances, but now it's dangerous. It's dangerous because people get anger. I've already seen on television people who were protesting the confinement and went out into the street to call for liberation, but they had weapons in their arms, automatic weapons. I know this is a political statement, and I know this country believes in the Second Amendment for reasons that, by the way, are not clear, because the Second Amendment is misinterpreted. This is having weapons for a militia in case the danger of a community against an enemy alien invading or something, but not to go and shoot just at anyone.
This long view of basically having lived a century. I always remember your love of a certain Victor Hugo poem where he said, "The century was 2 years old when I was born." And for you, you have seen so many different things throughout this century, and yet this is a new moment, is it not? It's a moment that nothing quite is as...
No, it's nothing quite, and let me say, it's not good to be very young. It's not good to be middle-aged. I mean, very young children, and about to go to school, about to go to college, or getting out of college, starting in life. So it's a very difficult moment. People who are about to get married, very hard. But it is especially hard, I think, for someone who's at the end of life, because we think it's bad enough to leave this world, but to leave this world to our children and to our students, because in my case, my entire career has been devoted to teaching, and therefore the future generations, to leave under those circumstances, not to mention the fact that burials have become impossible. Accumulation of corpses in trucks. Have you read about that?
Yeah.
In New York, in Brooklyn, I think the funeral parlors cannot cope. It's really so. When we talk about retiring in our room and dreaming about Boccaccio and about Mandoni, it's very nice. But there are the harsh realities, and now we need beauty. We need our sense of humor, which comes out. In fact, there is a lot of humor circulating under difficult circumstances. In persecution, humor is always flourishing. Humor, satire, sure, that's very important. And so we find resources, but a serene life is also valuable.
And humor has so often been what has come to the fore to undo certain forms of fundamentalism. I mean, we need humor. We need that lubricant, as it were.
Sure. We always need it. We need homo ludens,
Yes.
We are proud of being wise. And there was Homo erectus to begin with, then Homo sapiens. But that's not enough. Then comes the best in us. And not everybody has reached it. It's Homo ludens, playful.
Playful, yes.
To be able to play with ideas, to play with concepts, to contradict oneself, to be skeptical of ideas and of authority. Yes, that's very, very important. And it's brought out in difficult times. We've seen this under political regimes, whether it's under communism or other areas of the world, under fascism. Jokes circulate. Literature flourishes sometimes because good literature, it depends on the ability also to communicate multiple levels of meaning. And multiple levels of meaning are not easily deciphered. They have to be interpreted. So, in a sense, dissidence and resistance to authority and good literature go hand in hand.
So many things come to mind. One of them is I'd like to bring back to your mind a beautiful tribute you wrote for someone I knew as well, Professor Robert Fagles. You said he had lived in constant familiarity with the poets of the past and present. His memory was rich with echoes and quotations. When I read that, I thought of you. I thought that this was a very good portrait of Victor Brombert.
Well, this is perhaps one of the reasons we cherish art and literature, because it is a contact with the past. It is an image and sign of survival. I think it's Henri Malraux who said somewhere, I don't know where, I forgot. He said the first caveman who had the idea of drawing a bison on the wall of the cave. So he did it because he knew that the bison was mortal, and he himself was mortal too. And it is desire to immobilize the image of the bison is an elementary struggle against death. And from there one could argue that all art, and all art is art of that struggle for survival. And that is true, and that's why when we recite a poem, we not only remember the poem, but we remember our remembering.
And we remember the poem, we remember our remembering. And as Proust said in his beautiful essay on reading, Sur la lecture, he talks about not necessarily even remembering what he was reading, but remembering when his mother or his aunt or someone interrupted his reading and said, it is time for lunch, it is time for dinner. And that interruption in a way becomes the history of the reading of that book. And so that...
Well, this reminds me of my mother, who was in the other room, and while I was supposed to do my homework, but instead of doing my homework, I was reading I was a little boy, I was reading a detective story, Arsène Lupin,
Yes.
But I had it in a position so that I could quickly put it in a drawer when I heard my mother's footsteps, because when she came in, I was again working on my homework.
Yeah.
I had already then the notion that there was something more precious than my homework.
Right.
And it was the book I was reading.
Your interest in literature has often been connected, I think, to your interest in understanding the end of life, as it were. And there is one line of Borges I really love, which I'm wondering how it would resonate for you. Borges said that when writers die, they become books, which is, after all, not too bad an incarnation.
Beautiful. It's beautiful. This is basically what Marcel Proust was thinking, and it's also the image of the writer on his deathbed still correcting the proofs. And then the books. Do you perhaps remember in Proust, À la recherche du temps perdu, there are the books of Bergotte exhibited in the bookstore in groups of 3, Trinity, after his death. And so they become symbols of his survival. He died, but he is alive.
Another life.
Another life.
Another life. Victor, in closing, this is such a dark, dire, delirious moment, and it does remind us of the famous Brecht poem where he says, in these dark times, will there be singing? Yes, there will be singing about these dark times. I'm wondering if you wouldn't do me the pleasure of reciting a poem, whatever it may be, that comes to mind right now, that offers you even a shard of hope or a shard of pleasure, or whatever it is it might offer you.
Do you know the sonnet of Shakespeare? That time of year thou mayst in me behold, when yellow leaves, or few or none, do hang upon those boughs that shake against the cold. There, ruined, quiet, where late the sweet birds sang. Of course, it goes on, but it's so beautiful.
It's so beautiful. Let's leave our conversation on "It's so beautiful." Victor, it has been a privilege and a pleasure for me to talk to you. It always is, and
Well, I'm glad you end with the word pleasure again.
Again,
very good.
Good. I'm glad you approve.
I am not only approve. I say bravo.
Excellent. Well, bravissimo, Victor. Bravissimo, Victor.
Or as Don Giovanni says, archi bravo.
How would he sing it?
Archi. It is not sung. It's a recitativo secco. It's not part of an aria.
Right.
No, the aria is La ci darem la mano. La ci darem la mano.
La mi dirà di sì.
Sì.
Vorrei.
Vedi non è lontan, partiam da qui. Yeah.
The lines from Don Giovanni that I love so much are repentati, sì, no. Anyway, Victor, what a pleasure, and take good care, and I hope that we meet soon again. For the moment, I send you a virtual hug.
And yes, and you be very, very careful.
I will.
It's a pleasure to talk with you. A pleasure. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
To support this show and Dublab's progressive programming, go to dublab.com/support.